David Bohm Seminar, Friday night, March 20th, 1992, Oak Grove School, Ojai, California.
Yes, well, it's been some time, a long time since we've met, and a great many things have happened in the world, but not terribly surprising in some ways, but surprising in other ways. That the Soviet Union has fallen apart and into many different nations now, and we've had the Gulf War, which was expected, and we have this continuation of the civil war in Yugoslavia. We have the continuation of the problem of fundamentalism and religion of Muslim and others. And, the build-up that's taking place there. We've had the contradiction of policy whereby President Bush has been sending arms into Iraq until the very last moment, and then suddenly we have to oppose them. And we have this economic problem. That is, the Russians, the people of the former Soviet Union, are now very enamored of capitalism, but capitalism doesn't seem to be working all that well here. There's no sign yet of a solution of this economic problem. It's true that socialism has failed, but it's not clear that any other system is going to work either in the long run. In a way, we have a continuation of more or less the sort of things that have been going on. Some things have improved. We find that the danger of nuclear war has receded a great deal. We have the new situation in South Africa that the white minority has agreed to share power with the blacks, which is a hopeful sign, although there's obviously going to be a lot of trouble there. And, now, but I think that you can say that the more it changes, the more it remains the same, as the French say. And I'd say, you see, that there are a great many problems. And one of them, which we've discussed before here, is fragmentation. And see that nations are fragmented. See, no sooner have the Soviet Union got rid of communism when they fragmented into a large number of nations, and Yugoslavia has fragmented, and even Britain is talking of Scotland becoming independent, and and here somebody told me that there's talk of Northern and Southern California separating. Although I don't know how serious that is.
Might be by default.
What? By default.
By default.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me, I'll take the coat off. It's getting warm. Put that here. Yeah, so I think that we want to discuss what's underlying all this. You see, and we have said that the process of thought underlies this, that this fragmentation is the result of a certain way of thinking, of thought, right? It's a thought which breaks everything up, which takes something and treats it as separate from its surroundings and from things with which it may be closely connected. So, see, when we divide something up like that, we ignore the connections. See, it's all right to divide things which are not closely connected, But we extend this to nations and to all sorts of things, economies and families and various divisions of knowledge, specialties, things which are actually quite connected. We are applying fragmentation far beyond the domain in which it should really be applied. And also we unite things within these fragments which are not united. You see, the nation is not really all one. There are a great many different groups in each country of different, the poor and the rich, and the different ethnic groups and the different religions and different political interests and so on. So fragmentation is a kind of distortion or illusory way of thinking, and that it's applying the notion of division beyond the point where it should be applied. Now, that leads to the illusion that the world is made of fragments. For example, when you cross from one country to another, you feel that there's a big change. But in fact, there's no change. You see that you have only a boundary defined by people. They may have built a fence, and the countries are very similar. The people may be very similar, except they speak different languages, which resulted from their whole way of thought. See, the division was established by thinking, by thought, right? And it's maintained by thought, beyond the point where it makes sense. And people are giving it such importance, they say you must make everything subservient to that division, to risk your life for it or your money or whatever it is. That division takes first priority. Well, thank you. Right, so I think that what we would like to do here is to go into it. What is the source of this movement of fragmentation? You see, it's in us, right? Now, could we talk about it here as to how it originates?
There are some people who believe that the brain itself is functionally fragmented.
Yes.
And that, in essence, that there are almost like individual personalities that we each have that function at various times. So that there's some physiological reasons that we somehow operate that way.
Yes, well, certainly the brain may be divided into different functions to some extent, but these functions are closely connected. I mean, for example, the emotional function is centered somewhere in the thalamus, in the base of the brain, the intellectual function up here in the cortex, the prefrontal lobes. Now, between them is a very thick bundle of nerves which connects them, so that they must be in a very close relationship. If we try to say that they are separate, it's not going to work, right? Is that clear what I mean?
Maybe we need to differentiate between parts and fragments.
Yes.
You can't say the brain is naturally created fragments.
Yeah.
So it has different parts or functions.
Yes.
One would maybe need to distinguish those two things.
Yes, the part, you see, it has the whole in view, the part of the whole, but the fragment is something which has been broken off arbitrarily. That's when you smash something. The very word fragment is based on the notion of to break, you see, its root.
Do you think that this fragmentation is universal? It dates, I mean, is it a function of all human beings and always has been, do you think? Or is it something that's more culturally determined?
Well, it may well be culturally determined, but most cultures have had some kind of fragmentation. I mean, even if you go very far back, then various tribes, have the word for human being is the word for a member of the tribe. So, therefore, another tribe is different, right? And therefore, you have broken up the human race into various fragments. So, I think it seems there's a trap somewhere in the whole process of thought itself, right?
Language seems to intensify fragmentation and people talking different languages and not understanding each other, and then even in the same culture. I mean, women talk more about feelings and men tend to talk more about, in an intellectual way. I mean, even in a marriage, one knows that can cause fragmentation till you learn to understand each other and try and meet somewhere. So, I mean, the feeling orientation and the intellectual orientation seem to me quite a major cause of misunderstanding.
Yes, well, every one of these differences has a certain reality, but the trouble is that we break it off. You see, we have a sharp boundary, and what's inside we define as masculine or feminine, just as we do with the nation. Now, there seems to be a tendency in thought to do that, and what I mean by thought is to include the whole process, which I'll discuss.
I was thinking on the plane, I was sitting next to a German, and he talked about how maybe the English and the French could get together more if they could accept each other's different ways of seeing. Like he saw the English as rather flowery in their expression.
Flowery? Oh, I never heard of that.
Too. And the French as very more pragmatic, both of which was quite surprising to me. So it was interesting just seeing those sort of divisions.
This was a German man talking about the English and the French.
He's probably talking about himself.
Do you think possibly the sort of fundamental fragmentation is maybe the different parts of the brain not working in harmony somehow as kind of the source?
Well, it's hard to know what the source is. I mean, it may be connected in some way. There has been a theory, of course, that you have three brains: the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and the human. I mean, the later one, the intellectual one. Three phases of evolution. But these various parts of the brain are really closely connected. So they will have some tendency to have an relatively independent function, but must be closely connected. Now, why? I don't think that that in itself will lead to fragmentation, though it may help to build it up. See, like the division of the emotions and the intellect can be based on the fact that there is an intellectual function and an emotional function closely connected. Now, but why has the connection been broken? You see, they remember this example of the man who, in the 19th century, who had an explosion in the quarry, had an iron bar go through his head and come out the other side, and it destroyed that connection, you see. So his emotions became very erratic, and he couldn't actually follow an intellectual thought very far. Because, you see, the intellect and the emotions should work together. Now, the intellect could tell whether an emotion is appropriate or not. And the emotions give the intellect the very reason to function. You know, the urge to function and the sense of value and importance. And
Isn't the trouble asking if the brain itself isn't the cause of fragmentation, is that once you have fragmentation in the brain, it causes a lot of dysfunctional behavior?
well, if you have fragmentation, it will cause that, but why do we have it?
Well, I'm just saying it would be difficult to decide whether the brain was causing the fragmentation or the fragmentation was causing what appeared to be a fragmented brain. It would work. It would be sort of a process happening there that would be very difficult to distinguish what happened first.
Yes, well, suppose we take this tribe who has a word for human being and no word for people of another tribe as a human being. So it seems that is a way of thought which produces fragmentation. Now it may, if you see, the attempt to control the emotions would tend to fragment the function. See, in society we must have some control over the emotions, at least prevent it from going too far, and yet when you try to do it, you produce fragmentation. Yes.
which produces fragmentation in a.
Yeah, well, in order to think of controlling the brain, you must think that the various parts are really independent, rather fairly independent, right?
It's like the balancing mechanism is gone.
I wonder if, I think that the emotional brain develops in the individual before the intellectual, before language comes in. So an infant has feelings about things, but he can't either control them or manipulate them through language or intellect. And then the intellect develops in order to explain and to feed something back into that emotion. So you get a funny system there. And it's the system that seems to go wrong. It's the feedback that seems, from the way I've thought about it, where it seems to go wrong. Now, what it is that's going wrong, I don't know. And how one steps in there and sort of smooths it out so that it all works. I haven't a clue. That's probably what we're hearing. But
yeah, well,
it's somewhere in there.
Yes, it seems we haven't got a way of getting hold of it because
it's systemic. It isn't linear.
Yes. Yes, it's the whole system. The various parts of the system work together. And see, in a system, each part is interrelated, not only externally, but also its very being depends on the other parts of the system. If you have, say, a corporation, all the different departments, they not only relate to each other, but their existence depend on each other. They wouldn't exist without each other. And none of them would exist without thought. The thought that tells them what the corporation is supposed to be doing. Now, we don't seem to be able to break into this. How to stop it, right? See, you can tell somebody that nationalism is absurd, and up to a point they'll see it. Like before the First World War, students in England, in Oxford, they thought that nationalism was quite absurd, and they all agreed not to fight if called upon. But then when the First World War came, everybody was there volunteering. So what made them do it?
In the system of intellect and emotions, it seems to me intellect tends to punish the emotions in some way.
Well, I think it's trying to control them. You see that society finds, at least that people think, that these emotions can become dangerous, like emotions of anger and hate and fear. And we attempt to control the emotions by saying we shouldn't let them go, right? Now that's going to affect the emotions because of that big bundle of nerves. It is, in fact, a legitimate function of the intellect to say that certain emotions are out of proportion. Now, that can go wrong. And, they may attempt to, as you say, drive them down or punish them or repress them.
Well, in that vein, you mentioned not being able to break into the problem or the difficulty or the pattern. It seems that before you would come to the feeling of breaking into it, that you would have to see it.
We have to see what's going on, yeah.
Right. So what I'm wondering is, what is the difference between, or is there a difference between seeing it initially, or here seeing it and there seeing it at different times, or for some duration of time, and then either turning what you see into an image of that which you've seen, and or then trying to break into it. In other words, it seems that the very notion of breaking into it could be based on having turned your initial perception of the problem into a fixed idea of what it is and how to deal with it. So part of my question is, what is the nature of really seeing it, as opposed to doing something about it or trying to fix it?
Yes, well, I think we have to ask, how do we really see it? And we have to sort of see all the sides together as a whole, or otherwise we're going to focus on one side or the other. And since it's the system, when we affect one side, we'll affect the other. You see that is one of the points that, and the difficulty in doing that is that the thought process is able to produce results and doesn't know that it has produced them. It may produce, the thought that somebody has treated me badly and that he's ignored me and so on could produce a feeling of anger or something else, and it affects the emotions, but we don't see the connection. See, we suddenly see this anger appearing, treat it as independent, and saying either we say we're justified, or we could say it's not justified, we must control it. Right?
So thought wants to separate itself from the feeling. In a sense, it wants to distance itself in some way from the feeling, disown it.
Well, I don't think thought doesn't seem to know that it's connected to the feeling, or even that the feeling, you may sense the feeling is affecting your thought, right? That's possibly distorting it. Or in some cases, if it's a proper feeling, it would be enhancing the thought.
It can be that the feelings seem very overwhelming, rather dangerous.
Yes.
Because they seem huge and they'll take you over. So I think that's when the sense comes in.
Yes, well, the notion that there is a separate entity who will control this feeling. Now, it creates the fragmentation, but you see, that seems quite real.
My thoughts about certain things, I don't see them as thought. I don't experience them as thoughts. I experience them as just, that's the way things are.
Yeah.
And I think that's the critical thing. And if I'm constantly looking as I go through my life saying, well, that isn't really the way things are necessarily. It's just my thought about it. And I'm going to end up sort of bumping into walls and missing my mouth with the coffee cup sort of thing. It becomes almost, it seems to me, too difficult to keep that awareness that my view of the world isn't actually the way the world is. There's that hook gets in there and says that what is one is out here, and it's not being fabricated.
Yes. Well, you see, thought works by making a distinction between itself and the object of thought, right?
Yeah.
And now that distinction is valid in certain areas where the thought doesn't have much effect on the thing, on the object. Like this object, the chair, is not greatly affected by my thinking about it. Now, on the other hand, there are other areas where thought has a very great effect on the object. The emotions are one of them, the state of the body is another, and also thought has created everything that we see, the buildings, the farms, the factories, the society. It has affected the whole world, as it created the pollution and the ozone, change in the ozone layer. It all came because of the way thought went, right? Now, but then when people meet that, they say there's an ozone problem, and there's an ecological problem, and there's a problem of slums and ugly cities, and erosion of farmland, and these nations are very threatening, and religions are threatening, and we say they're armed, all these people are armed, and it's like saying, well, we've sort of forgot that we armed them. And the thought doesn't keep track of the fact that it is active and actually does things. And it then treats these things as independent. Now, in doing that, it complicates the whole situation, because it attempts to solve the problem as if they were independent while it keeps it going, and the two things really make it worse.
At that level, it sounds reasonable that it should be a way to solve the problem.
Is thought trying to
Yeah.
What's happening to the anger? Is it getting stronger, being suppressed down in the basement of our organism, or is it getting weaker? Because we say we have certain moral statements. We must not be angry. You shouldn't. So the moment anger, which I find it is a fact, coming up, and right away soul tries to control it and suppress it by very strong shouldn't and mustn't. What's happening to that strong emotion of anger? Is it getting stronger, or is it down by control?
Well, yes, what happens, either if you try to control it, you see, but at the very attempt to control it, you are defining the problem by thought, and that thought which tries to control it must say, I am angry. And in saying I am angry, it must sustain anger. Exactly. In other words, the thought that I am angry will help, that I am perhaps justified in being angry, will help to sustain anger. And then there's another thought which says I must control it. So it may be that you will lose awareness of it, but it will still be there. It will flare up, at various times.
They say at the moment, right? I don't know how right that is. There has been thousands of years such a suppression of anger and suppression of hostility and suppression of all of fear that this suppression has become a dangerous cause for cancer. I mean, that's going on now. And I'm getting scared by suppressing these emotions.
What? I didn't hear that.
Sorry?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
I get scared.
Oh.
These emotions come up.
Mm-hmm.
Fear, anger, hostility. Before, the whole traditional upbringing is suppress it and control it. Now I get scared if I'm trying to suppress it and control it.
Mm-hmm.
I better let it and live with that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying if I feel killing somebody, I'm going to kill you, but I'm staying with that.
Yes.
And live with that. And it takes some time being with that and watching it, how it evaporates, how it dies.
Yes, I agree. I found that recently I found it much more useful, valuable to say, I'm feeling angry,
Mm-hmm.
and actually to express it in some way. First of all, to accept it in myself and find it's actually very useful energy. It's actually very useful energy, I think, for women to get in touch with their anger and, if necessary, have some full-fledged anger to get out of certain situations. I don't know if the analogy works, but I've been trying to give up smoking, and the most useful thing I've come across, and I have more or less given up smoking. I've had maybe 10 cigarettes in 3 months, something like that. But the idea was that I need to accept the desire that I want a cigarette. Just accept the desire.
It's the fact, yeah.
And actually, after that, I don't often want the cigarette, but instead of fighting the impulse, but to accept that's how I'm feeling. And the same with anger, to accept that's how I'm feeling. It seems to help the communication in my brain or in my body too. And I'm fortunate I have an outlet in that I love to paint, and I find the energy is extremely useful used in painting. Other things too, but for me that's been it's been very freeing.
Yes, well, sometimes that will work, but you see, if we have anger between countries, and I just accept that we're angry, we all know that, it won't work. You see, or else if somebody is bigger than you are, stronger than you are,
Yes.
You can accept that you're angry, but you have to be careful.
Yes, absolutely.
A little bit of fear ought to come in there at that point.
All this anger and suppression further needs to be examined. These are just to be angry and to suppress are all sounds like the kind of conditioning or programming, but there's something deeper
Yes.
making us decide what we're angry about and how we're going to respond to it, and that needs to be uncovered.
Yeah, so there's thought underlying them. The thought is saying that
What's the thought?
Because such and such is wrong, and it's wrong. The idea that it's wrong is a thought.
Well, maybe a deeper thought that I have something else.
Yeah, well, the fact that something is wrong shouldn't necessarily make you angry. But what is it that makes you angry is that something has been done wrong to me, right? Or to whatever my country or whatever I'm identified with.
Well, then it's a problem.
Of course, you could feel there's an injustice that has been done. That you're angry at that, right? So anger might have a meaning in a certain area, but it seems that it gets out of that area, just like dividing things up. See, that we keep anger alive by thinking about it and thinking of what has been done to us, the injustice and the, not being treated fairly and so on. And so at some point, there's the difference between a short burst of anger that might make sense and the anger which doesn't make sense, which just keeps on smoldering along.
That line of thought keeps coming back to this notion of the independent self.
Mm-hmm.
I'm mad because something is wrong, something's been done wrong to me, or even to my values, if it's done to someone else.
Or to my country, or to my
whatever.
family.
Still, me becomes the central issue of all of these things. And from there I start fragmenting, because somehow or another I see me as being separate from everything else at that point, needing to be either protected or to defend or to flee or what have you. It seems that every time I've thought about these things, and when we've talked about them in the past, I keep coming back to this big wall of the self, the independent self, that believes itself to be independent as the source of trouble. At least it's as near to the source as I've got.
Is thought itself fragmentary? Is that what we're asking? We were asking about the brain
Mm-hmm.
It was naturally fragmented. Now we're saying is thought fragmentary by its very nature?
Yes, well, see, thought is always an abstraction. It doesn't get the whole, right?
I mean, it always just sees a part.
Well, it not necessarily abstracts some part. There's the concrete, remember saying reality, the whole. And the thought, in order to make thought useful, it's necessary to abstract what is relevant. Otherwise, it has not much use to try to take everything into account. So thought should actually abstract something.
Is abstraction the same as fragmentation?
See, if you abstract what is relatively independent, then it's not fragmentation.
But to do it in a way that doesn't follow.
Yeah, so you see, like if you abstract the parts of a machine, you can say, well, it has this part, this part, this part. But if you were to abstract, smashing the parts or else mixing them up, so that you divided somewhere where there was a solid connection.
So thought has been trained to function fragmentarily, but it doesn't necessarily have to do that.
No, well, it always has to abstract, you see. And it has to be incomplete.
But we're saying that's not the problem.
No. Yes, no, that's not exactly the problem, no.
Would it be fair to say that one example of abstraction would be a culture, say a culture somewhere in northern Africa, and then someone draws a line within that culture and says it's one nation over here and another nation over there?
Yeah, I say this is, this is moral behavior holy, or this is infidel. This is now. See, they see this distinction as a real distinction, a tremendous gulf between them. Now, but in fact, if it isn't that way, then it's fragmentary. You see.
But where do we begin to tell the difference? Because take the Soviet Union breaking up into separate nations. Each one of those have their own reason. They feel like they do have, to some extent, a separate culture. They do have
Yes.
their own language, perhaps. They do have various things which define them as a common entity.
Yes.
And so if they were to listen to this, they would say, well, it's not a fragment, it's a part, in the way we discuss part. You know?
But it isn't a part of any whole, you see. You see, it's perfectly valid to say we've got a particular culture and a particular situation, and the others have a somewhat different one, but we all are connected and depend on each other. In fact, the various nations within the Soviet Union are completely interdependent now, but each one is insisting to and behaving as if it were totally independent.
Does it maybe come down to what sort of significance you're giving the abstraction and the differences? I mean, you might say, yes, there are differences, there's a different language or whatever, but what kind of significance does that have?
Yes, well, the significance is
where the problem is.
Yes, is this thing which you've abstracted really quite independent of or separated from something else that we've abstracted? Or are they closely connected? Now, how do we find that out? You see, well, you find it out by further observation, right? That they are, in fact, closely connected, and therefore this is not a valid abstraction.
Do you do the abstraction, or are you abstract?
Well, the self is, the brain does, you see, the thought process does the abstraction.
The imputation that I do it, is that helpful?
Well, you experience it as saying, I'm doing it. You see, at first, it just happens automatically, right? It's part of the whole background. Now, if you say, I have abstracted, well, all right, that's what I did. But in fact, I think that you don't really control it that well.
No, it's more like it controls you.
Hmm?
Maybe that's what you are. It's more like you're downstream of that than the upstream.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, you are the process of abstraction. You see.
Maybe one is not aware that one is abstracting. One thinks one perceives the whole, and one works with the whole picture. But actually, not only is perception partial, but also beyond that. When we act on it, we act from a partial point of view. And that what divides, because we think it's a whole and it's not really.
Yes, well, we've made a mistake. In order to think this is a whole, we have to think it's separate from something else. You see, otherwise it couldn't be a whole. So we have made the assumption that this thing is separate. At least it has been made. You see, now this, we didn't make it, it was built up gradually. You see, the thought process is going on by itself. You know, see, we also have the belief that we are controlling this thought process, you know, that we are doing it. That there's some entity inside who is doing it. Now, the thing is that thought process itself has a kind of dynamic or inertia of its own. It moves on its own. And you see, what we can say is that this is the conditioning. You see that the thought process is really the past, the effect of the past. It's present, but it's the effect of the past which is acting again. Now, in the past, we have made various conclusions and judgments and so on. And these have been left in the brain somewhere, and they react.
But it's the result of past perception.
Or past perception and past thinking.
Perception will give rise to a process that will give rise to thinking.
Well, yes, it's the past perception. Well, we have drawn conclusions from the past perception in thought, right? We have said that we have interpreted through thought, right? Now,
Well, it seems that we have a feeling that we're in control, and then we discover we're not, either through someone else's actions or our own strong feelings. Something comes up, threatens our feeling of control and order, and we get scared of being out of control. The world isn't the way we see it or want it to be. So it might be anger, It might be some very strong feeling which we just somehow we seem to be unable. I see this in a sort of general way, but in general, we seem to be scared of very strong feelings and scared of being out of control.
Yes, well,
That's muddled up with anger too.
I mean, it seems it would be valid to be frightened if you get out of control. See, it isn't quite so simple.
Well, you're suggesting that is the case, that the thought is controlling us,
yes,
whoever us is.
Yes.
But we all like to think that we are controlling thought.
Yes.
We don't do such a good job of it, but ultimately we should be able to. Where maybe it's just that whole thing turned upside down, and our sense of ourselves and being able to control is another manifestation of this power of thought, which is something quite different.
Yeah,
so I think it's a point well worth exploring.
I think that
thought precedes the self.
Yes. See, we may think that the emotions are out of control, but the emotions are maybe the result of thought. Now, the thought behind it is really what is out of control. The thought which is trying to control is itself the source of the uncontrollable emotions, of the emotions that go beyond. It's not that they should be controlled, but they go beyond appropriate. They're no longer appropriate. They become stronger than appropriate. They become emotions that are not appropriate. Now, the thought, however, having helped to produce those emotions, the process of thought then treats them as something separate, which has to be controlled, while it is at the same time continuing the thought which makes them go out of control.
But maybe there's something valid at depth about these strong feelings. Like maybe there's something valid that we are scared of the world situation that we're in, the ecological situation. Maybe we're angry about it too, about the control other people have over us, or the conditioning, our own conditioning. So maybe what we're scared of, this sort of strong feeling, there is a validity there, but we haven't learned how to hear what it's saying without acting on it violently in some way or destructively.
It must be a much more profound relationship we can have with the reality of the situation than fear. Yes. Why do we focus on fear? Why don't we focus on intelligence or perception? Fear is such a marginally informative form of behavior at best.
But it gives us messages about what's going on.
Yeah, but the messages come to us in a way that makes us afraid of it.
Well, it's certainly familiar territory. It's tends to be being experienced. So it's a good starting place to move toward what you're suggesting, maybe.
Actually, I don't think it's very familiar to people at all, because one of the big things people do when they get afraid is they shy away from it immediately. So we not only have fear, but we have fear of fear.
Yeah, well, that's part of it, yeah.
Huge problem. Make sure that as soon as fear comes up, it isn't dealt with. If we want to make it familiar territory, that would be worth going into. We would have to go into it with something besides fear.
Eventually, yeah.
But I feel a lot of this has to do, it seems a big topic at the moment, but denial and repression seem to be in the air in lots of people's teachings at the moment. And well, I don't think you get anywhere by not looking at a problem, by saying, I have an ideal that it could be better and there's a more intelligent way of dealing with it. But I think, you have to look at the ground plan somewhere too. Anyhow, that's it. That's enough.
Minutes ago, we were talking about the process of abstraction. And part of this conversation so far has kind of gotten at that you tend to make this imputation of responsibility like I'm thinking and I'm doing this. And at another level, well, this process is kind of like I'm dumping out of this process all the time. I'm not causing it. There's a shift in thinking about it. But at the edge that you were at earlier, abstraction not necessarily itself being fragmentary, then that process which regulates what's relevant in the process of abstraction seems to be where fragmentation is.
Well, it is a failure of seeing the whether the thing we have divided is actually independent. But why does it fail?
It seems peculiar that if we took the example in the Soviet Union again, for instance, the Baltic states now realize that they can't really do without the oil from Russia, for instance. They could have known that before. I mean, it isn't the same mistake.
Yes, well, you see, the importance which is given to these divisions is really what's behind it, saying that the fact that we are Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and so on, with our culture and so on, is given the first priority. And therefore it becomes, these other things sort of pale into insignificance until later. So you see, there are a great many things that are coming in. Now, you see, the thought process works in a way automatically. This is the thing to notice. It can be compared to a set of reflexes. See, remember the conditioned reflex of the dog, Pavlov, that every time it sees food, it salivates. And if you ring a bell, perhaps that reminds it of the food, and then it salivates. But after a certain point, it can just directly salivate when you ring the bell. Now, you get association, and then you can go on from there and on and on. Now, you see, we may similarly have reflexes that whenever something happens, that it just goes, right? Saying that, seeing that the national interest is at stake, there's a reflex of just giving it first priority. Right? Now, these reflexes are not conscious. You see, like the reflex, the knee-jerk reflex, if you hit the knee, it'll jerk, but it's just simply a reflex, means that the impulse bends around somewhere in the spinal column, but instead it may bend around further back in the brain, so that when something happens, and it gives rise to a thought, and that may give rise to an action or to another thought, and so on and so on. So the thought process seems to go automatically in this way.
Usually one would expect that if things don't work out, you somehow,
yes.
Snap out of it.
Yes. Well, why don't we snap out of it then, you see?
In other words, if we have massive message back that this isn't working, why is it still going on, right?
Yes. I mean, there's a deception goes on saying that, so what would happen to the Baltic states? It's just simply at first that the reflex gives a great importance to the question of nationalism and culture and so on. And it considers that will all somehow work out.
Well, it gives people a lot of energy. I mean, it can set people up. Politicians would capitalize on that, and even people who maybe were communists and so on, they say we're really Georgians or we're really Estonians, and there's a lot of energy.
One of the problems, it seems to be, is what we're discussing is that when any intelligence starts penetrating into this illusion, if I can use that word, things like fear and anger come up and siphon up all meaningful energy. If a person realizes the reality of the situation and gets afraid, that sort of shuts the energy and stops any movement towards intelligence that we're talking about. And all of a sudden, being afraid means you have to protect yourself, and you're back in the whole process in the program. The program has a way of keeping itself going in the face of a tremendous amount of information that's erroneous, and one of the things is fear, anger.
Yes, well, the emotions and the thoughts are both that we've called the program. That's a little bit misleading. The word program has been written beforehand. See, this is the conditioning which has developed by the constant repetition of certain things, or the stronger the emotion connected with something, the more powerful the reflex. So if you have had an experience of strong emotions, even once or twice is enough to establish it, or If the emotions are not so strong, that the constant repetition will establish it. And therefore, this thought process is going, as you say, like a program, but not something that was ever programmed. And this conditioning works just as unconsciously as the computer. Now, that's what keeps it going. And the inappropriate emotions come up. You see, if the emotions are appropriate, then okay, but let's say that the emotion of anger at another country is not appropriate. You see, it will always cause trouble.